When I started this podcast almost 2 years ago now, I literally had like a list of things that I like a questionnaire almost that I would ask people over and over, and it just basically became boring. And also, I realized that if I go in wanting something, that may not be the expertise or knowledge that you possess. So that's a bad way to go about it. So I learned over the time is basically most of my time is going to be sort of like actively listening to whatever you're saying to try and pick up on whatever expertise and ideas you seem to have, knowledge of in order to go into that avenue.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you bring that up because I struggle with that a lot. Like I struggle with this idea of as instructors, as experts, we need to have the answers. We need to know when a unanticipated question's asked. We need to have it ready and the answer ready. And what I've been trying to do in probably the last 5 years is back off of that and think what can happen if you figure it out together. I think a lot of great things can happen. The student has a part of it and they have there's autonomy in that and there's kind of like breakthroughs in that. I think you also, as an instructor and a lifelong learner, let's be honest, have some vulnerability that's really worthwhile. And so, but I have to be honest, I really struggle with that, especially because I think I always had this kind of, vision of what it looked like to be a professor and to have, be talking to a group of students who are so hungry for information and that you can deliver that. But I'm happy to see that kind of paradigm is changing more. But what I'm trying to say is I appreciate that you don't have a lot of built-in questions because then it becomes this more of a dance of you're listening, like you said, you're actively listening, and then you're responding to something May just said. And I think that's where all the good stuff comes in rather than I listen to a lot of podcasts and some of my favorite are this kind of meandering road versus the same question that the, host asks every single time. Yay, good. It's going to be what it is.
Marvelous. Well, you just brought up teaching, and I'm what you just said about how it used to be. I mean, like I remember being a student because I had a car accident when I was, I don't know, 18 years old, and somehow for some reason it sort of ended up saying like I need to be a teacher. I don't know how it got there, but anyways, but I decided to be a teacher at a very young age, I think, and so like I remember always thinking like, oh, I look forward to being that wealth of knowledge and the person that people admire and look up to and they listen to and respect, and I've realized after trying that in modern education and academia that it doesn't really work. Like the students these days and people in general, it doesn't matter their age, they don't really want to be lectured to. They don't want that. I don't think they're learning that way anymore. Like I think I'm 47. I think I'm 47. 47. My parents' generation, they were accustomed to being lectured to. That was normal. Like in my era, it was reasonably normal, but there was a beginning of a discussion. And I feel like a lot of the learning these days is going on in a more interactive way, in an engaging way, instead of sort of somebody in an ivory tower sort of just imparting their knowledge onto students kind of thing.
Exactly. And I think experiential too, people are learning so many, especially with this pandemic, and we've sort of been forced into that online learning platform. We have to think of other sensory experiences that people can exchange and share. But yeah, same experience.
All right, let's go back. I forgot to ask you, could you please pronounce your name correctly for me?
Yeah. So my first name is Gretchen, and my last name, if you're being really good in Dutch, you would say Schermerhorn, but most of my family pronounces it Schermerhorn.
All right, so obviously you're Dutch, or at least your heritage is Dutch.
Mhm.
Yeah, I just recently had a family member pass away, so we started down that family history stuff and found out I'm mostly German and partly Finnish.
Ah,
Had no idea.
So the more I've learned, really, I start thinking, although I didn't really grow up with any customs or anything like that, it has been interesting looking up information. Like there's a stop in New York called Schermerhorn, and turns out the Dutch were really heavily settled, parts of New York, especially Brooklyn, and they were all farmers and stuff. So that's made me think about what customs, what dress, or various things like that. Is there anything that you've thought, well, I should research this, or I should look into this?
Well, I know that there is a an antique store in Amsterdam with the name Dols as part of its title. I don't know why. And oddly enough, here in Prague, there's a mailbox company. Like they produce mailboxes called Dols. Like that's their name. I was just like, oh, that's interesting. I had no idea we had Czech relations, but so be it.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, family lineage. It's fascinating.
It
Like one,
really is. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Speaking of family lineage, how did you come to being creative? So childhood, parents, like, so what was your, were your parents creative? Did you have some great teachers? Like, how did you even come to sort of the creative industries?
Yeah, I was thinking about this in the shower a little while ago, where I have most of my great thoughts. And
As we all do.
it's like you need to be, for me at least, I need to be doing something else, cooking, showering, something that doesn't take a whole lot of my bandwidth so I can be doing something, but then also my mind opens up. But anyway, I was thinking about that question, and I was thinking about where I grew up and my parents and their influence. So let me start off with where I grew up. So I grew up in a tiny, tiny town, less than 2,000 people at the time, in Texas, Argyle, Texas, which is North Texas area, not far from Oklahoma or Louisiana. And what was unique about it, and I didn't know it at the time that it was unique. I just kind of thought that it was like everybody. But now that I live, right outside of DC, I see that not everybody has the experience of digging their hands in the dirt daily, making forts and trails, living near a creek, and my mom teaching us, my sister and I, how to make pinch pots out of what we thought was clay. What she told us was clay. It was mud, it was dirt, it was fine, it's close enough to clay. Our only neighbors were, there was a boy a couple of years older than me, and I really, really wanted to do everything he wanted to do. And so I got real scrappy at an early age because he was. So that was huge. Just really being tactile, hands on, gritty, scrappy, playful. But again, I didn't know that that was kind of unique to a lot of people, especially, as I get older. So that was crucial. That was important. That was real formative. That was part of formative years. And then also my parents were both really creative. And although my mom has an art degree, for her profession, she worked as a hospital administrator. And I think, like a lot of people, you and I were talking about careers and like our generation. I think that while it's changing now, it was much more acceptable to sort of have a career and have that same career for, until you retire. And I think my mom especially saw the sort of importance and stability and having a career. So my mom, at the same time, was always, again, she was the one teaching us about pinch pots, and to keep us quiet in church, she would draw for us, and we would just be mesmerized, the whole time. So we would be quiet. And my dad, although not an artist, he was a computer programmer. He was very into tinkering all the time. I remember one time he built like this geodesic dome in our backyard that was kind of like a tool shed. And, didn't know at the time, there's some Buckminster Fuller going on, but just having that like can do itness and building things. And he was always, I mentioned digging your hands in the dirt. He was always growing things. And like he taught me at a young age how to make a compost tincture, and real kind of hippy dippy. And I mean that like in not a condescending way, just again in a your relationship to the natural world. He in my family, especially on my dad's side, we were always singing and dancing. And nobody was particularly good at it, but that wasn't the goal. That wasn't important. It was expression and playfulness and comfort, like just being comfortable with yourself, putting yourself out there and singing. And now anybody who knows me knows that I'll just bust out in a little ditty or a chanty or something. And it can be annoying and sort of tickish, but I think that that's because of my dad. So yeah, creativity was all around us all the time. And I think, you know, when I don't remember saying this, but my mom told me that I said I wanted to be an artist when I was 5 years old. And well, I could also back that there were folks in our family who really were bona fide artists, you know, who made a living at it or who did it full time. So it wasn't like just because I didn't see it from my parents, I didn't know what that looked like. There were other people in the family. You know, we had paintings and we had my parents still have paintings in their house from grandparents. And so I did have a role model of kind of what that looked like. And I just loved putting things together, again, building things, scrapping things together. I rearranged my room all the time. I didn't know that that was creativity. I thought I was just moving shit around, but you know, I think that is a form of creativity, kind of looking at your space as an interior or an installation and moving things around. But I'm really thankful that I grew up where I did. Although I will say I tried to get out of it as fast as possible because you don't know what you have until you don't have it. And what I saw growing up was small town mentality. Everybody knows everybody. Pretty red. I mean, obviously that's changing a little bit in Texas, but it's still pretty red, pretty conservative. So, you know, I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. But looking back, it was pretty darn great growing up that way. That's kind of my childhood in a nutshell.
Oh yeah, everybody has this sense of they hate where they grew up for a while, and then later on they start looking back at a certain age, and you're like, oh no, wait, it actually was lot really nice. Like you're saying, like everybody knew everybody and all that. I grew up outside of Washington D.C. in Arlington, and everybody knew everybody there too. Like it's you know, I know it's changed in certain parts of the district, but in where we were, like, because my father was also the local minister,
Oh,
so everybody knew our business.
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I also bet that puts you under a particular eye of expectations too. A certain, you know, magnifying glass of behaviors probably.
very much so. Yeah, I rarely talk about that, but yeah, yeah, being a preacher's kid, a PK is yeah, you know, my family was meant as the guiding light of morals and ethics in a community because my father was the local leader of people's morals and ethics, and so there was a certain expectation, and it was a little bit even more difficult. My brother was the bad one in the family. He was more the black sheep than I was, even though I was the one getting arrested and doing drugs and all kinds of crazy stuff. So I was the good one doing
I guess
that.
it's all
So
relative, right? I mean,
very relative. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I used
what kind of minister? What kind what really what
Episcopal.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty liberal
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
grand scheme.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I used to work at the 930 Club actually,
Hmm. Hmm.
way back in the day. It was good times.
Yeah.
But yeah, once I found out I was being investigated by the Drug Enforcement Agency, I thought it was time for me to stop that job.
Oh. Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. We need to I do need to interview you. Yeah.
I still want to ask the DEA to like give me that file. I really want to see it. You know,
Yeah.
like Freedom of Information Act. Like I would love to see what they have on me.
Yeah. Yeah. You have any idea?
Well, what it was I was working at the 930 Club, and this guy, Cousin Mike, who was not my cousin, I don't know why we called him Cousin Mike. Cousin Mike's cousin, I know that sounds
No,
ridiculous, Frank,
you're kidding.
happened to be the DEA agent who was investigating me and a number of other people that worked at the 930 Club at the time. And he warned Cousin Mike to stay away from us. And of course, Cousin Mike then came and told us, hey, my cousin Frank is investigating you. So, yeah, we figured it was time to quit.
Wow. Okay. All right.
Yeah, someday I'll ask through Freedom of Information Act to get a copy of that file because that would be thoroughly entertaining, I'm
Yes.
sure. So, totally random topic. But anyways, so you wanted to get out of Texas as quickly as possible, and you ended up going to Arizona State, which is a phenomenal school for the arts. I know it primarily from printmaking and photography. Actually, they have a
Yeah.
really, really strong photography
Oh.
because I believe Jim Stone is there, right?
Jim Hijack?
No, Jim Stone, he's the guy that Jim Stone's the guy that literally wrote the book called like Basics of Photography.
Oh,
Like,
okay. Okay.
yeah, it's okay. You were in printmaking. You didn't need to know him. It's fine.
That's right. That's right. Although I will say that one of the things I really appreciated about the program was there was so much crossover. Even then, I got my MFA in 2004. And even then, there was a lot of crossover in, oh, okay, you're a printmaker, but you want to work in the sculpture department. Yeah. So while I didn't take any photography classes in graduate school, I did take several in undergrad. And it really helped inform the ideas in printmaking, especially when it came to thinking about light and emulsion and photo-based processes. So like, for example, cyanotype or collotype or Van Dyke printing, for example. So that was really beneficial. And actually now in my practice, I feel myself gravitating back towards things like pinhole photography, lumen printing, and I'm trying to, sometimes you probably do this too. It's like you find yourself moving towards something, but you're not exactly sure what it is. And then you find yourself trying to formulate whether it's an artist statement or some type of why. And I think the reason why for me is that you lose your ability to control what's going to happen to a certain extent. Yes, with understanding chemistry, practice and doing it over and over again, you gain that, you understand why something's doing something, but there's still this level of unpredictability that excites me. That challenge, that game is always exciting. And, it's not like pressing the undo button. It's not like pressing the back button. And I kind of like that. It almost to me reminds me a little bit about what we're talking about in that dance and that improvisation that's happening that can happen. So yeah, I was glad in undergrad to take some photo classes. So
Oh, yeah, I started off as a photography major, and I got my BA and my BFA in photography, and then I got to the San Francisco Art Institute, and I got there, and they were concerned with was what camera equipment are you using, what paper are you printing on, what light equipment are you using, and I was just like, I don't give a shit about any of that crap. Like, I care about what did the image mean, what are you trying to say, why are you producing this thing. And I switched. I became an interdisciplinary, or what they call new genre.
yeah,
And I'll tell you that education is. But I'll caveat this for the listener in particular, like having a foundation of like like a BFA in photography or whatever, choosing a discipline, and then going into interdisciplinary practices was fabulous. Those critiques and conversations in those multimedia classes were, just amazing because we were talking about what makes good art,
mm-hmm.
not what makes a good print or not what makes a good photograph or not, but just how did they express their idea effectively.
Yeah. I also
Best education.
Yeah, I also think, you hear this sometimes in discourse or in classes about knowing the rules and then, turning it on its head. And I think being able to understand the why is or the why something's happening rather than, you probably hear this, but sometimes I hear students say, "Oh, I meant it to be like that," or seasoned artist. And it's like, did you really?
No, they
So
didn't.
being able to understand and control those things so that you can say what you want to say, right? Make why is it good? And I believe it's firmly about communication and about making the media say what you want to say. So if you don't know that and you don't have that foundation, so that's almost what I heard you say, or I think that's what I heard you say. It's like having that strong foundation to be able to control those variables and understand what's happening. It's a moot point if you can't get someone from across the room to come over and look at your piece because it's poorly crafted, or it's shoddy, or it's got all sorts of problems. They're not gonna, it's like, who cares about the concept if it's poorly executed?
It's interesting you say that because, again, I'm American and I was trained in America, but I'm now in Europe. The nature of sort of the aesthetics, the sort of visual beauty of a piece of art is very different in Europe than it is in America from what I've been noticing. In America, generally I was taught like, and maybe I maybe I wasn't taught this, but maybe I just believe it, and that's what I thought I heard. But I thought my assumption was like you try to make something beautiful in order to entice people in to want to then understand more about why, about whatever the topic you're talking about. But that desire to make something beautiful to entice people is a very American thing.
Mm.
They do not consider that in Europe so much
Mm.
at all. They're more the concept is the primary purpose of it, and aesthetics as far as making something look beautiful is completely irrelevant to people in Europe as far as I can tell, except maybe like Parisians or something like that.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting.
It's weird. Well, okay, I'll give you a reason why I say that. In America, this is something I've learned through the podcast, through all these conversations I've had. So in America, it's generally very capitalistic. So like you produce an object, you sell that object, then you take that money and you invest it and make more. That's sort of the nature of the practice in America. In Europe, it's very much about you come up with a really great idea, you apply for a residency or a grant or some funding to produce the thing, and then there's no need to sell it because it's already been paid for by the grant or the residency or whatever. So it's not the intention or the need
Mm.
to sell is not important because the practice of producing it has already been paid for.
Yeah. So that makes me wonder, and I completely understand the logic and the thinking behind that, but it does make me wonder what what happens to that piece or pieces, or does that matter?
I don't know. I'm not sure what happens. I mean, a lot of times, well, no, I shouldn't even say. No, I have absolutely no idea what happens to them.
Well, I actually would buy into that model a lot more, but I guess the older I get and the more I think about the idea of making and the idea of creating is, for me, a lot about sharing. So for example, the other day I posted something. I've never done this because it feels, I don't know, to me it just feels a little desperate or shady or something, but I posted some of the pieces that I'm working on right now and said, hey, you want to trade? You up for bartering, or DM me if you're interested.
Okay, wait, hold on. You're saying on Instagram.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. And again, I was really hesitant about that, but then I'm trying to look into like why, what is that? Why are you feeling that? But I did it, and got some pretty good response with trades. And so the money, and luckily, I mean, we'll talk about this more. I have kind of a 9 to 5 that pays my bills. So that wasn't my end goal. It was really, how can I share what, it's not for me about the money, it's about sharing, getting it into people's homes, or getting it in front of someone who will appreciate it and likes it, and every time they look at it, they maybe think of something, is the most important thing. So I guess I'm sort of asking that, what happens to it? Does it just end up in that artist's home or under their bed? Or that's important to me because I want that to live with other people.
Oh, well, that's like when I when I talk to young artists, and I don't mean necessarily like by age, but I mean young to the practice, they often say like, "Oh, I make my work for me. I don't make it for anybody else." And I'm like, that's bullshit. Because if you made it for you, you wouldn't be showing it to me.
Mm,
So, but simply by the act of even showing your work to somebody else means that it's not just for you anymore.
mhm.
Like, and a lot of people sort of don't understand that balance of, there is that always that nagging thing of like, I want to make something that's true to myself, that's about me, about my aesthetic, whatever, my concepts. But there also does still need to be some engagement in the social, like the not necessarily social media, but like the I want the public to quote unquote like approve of it
Mm.
or appreciate it or respect it or whatever. Because as much as people say like, oh, I make it for myself, no, no, if you made it for yourself, you wouldn't show it to anybody.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, completely agree.
All right. Moving forward, you now work at Pyramid Atlantic, which I have a long-standing love for. I went to the
Yeah.
Corcoran School of Art in Washington, D.C., and one of my professors, I believe even multiples of my professors, but the one I associate most with it is Georgia Deal, and she was also working at Pyramid Atlantic when I was there back in 1998 era, that time frame. And I believe she's still working there as well.
Yeah, she
Is she?
she recently taught a class before she and Tom moved to Asheville area. She taught a class for us, and yeah, we've had a long-standing relationship with Georgia. She's been so supportive with us, meaning, when we need art for an auction or teaching a class. I mean, granted, she gets paid, but she's just always game. I love that. She's always down for stuff. So that openness has always been appreciated.
Okay, so for the listeners who may not have the admiration for Pyramid Atlantic that I do, please tell everybody sort of what is Pyramid Atlantic.
Yeah. So, Pyramid Atlantic is an art center with a specialization in contemporary printmaking, papermaking, and book arts. And we like to say that we make contemporary art with antiquated equipment. And so, when you walk in, you'll see and hear the presses running, smell the ink. We're very deliberately low tech and hands on. And while we have toyed with digital art and having digital labs, and I certainly am a huge advocate of that media, we always come back to having a haptic, physical, hands-on experience when making. So that's really important. We have a gallery upstairs, and we have exhibitions that rotate about every 6 to 8 weeks. Of course, we've kind of gone to a virtual platform, although we did have an in-person opening in November with timed tickets and low capacity. We have 17 private artist studios, so all of those artists have anywhere from 125 to 300 square feet, and they have a key and literally come and go 24 hours a day. We have artist residencies, internships. We actually have one particular residency, longstanding residency with the Corcoran, whereby their professors nominate an outstanding graduate or undergraduate student, and they have a residency. We have fellowships for, I would say, seasoned, mid-career to seasoned artists. There's a lot of layers, and I'm just kind of scratching the surface, but
It's lovely.
it's
That's good.
yeah, it's a pretty amazing, almost 40-year-old organization, which is like 2 lifetimes for a nonprofit.
Well, okay. Well, that's the key thing too. It's a nonprofit.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay. Now, in your title is called artistic director. Now, I see artistic director in all kinds of things from
Sure.
plays and theater to dance to this. So, what does the term artistic director mean in a space like this?
Well, it means that a couple different things. It means that oftentimes I conceptualize either as a partnership with our executive director or some of the staff programs. So everything from exhibition ideas to artist recruitment to education programs. And in our education programs, they're not only workshops, hands-on workshops, but also with our residency program. So coming up with particular ideas a lot of it's conceptual, but I would say that what's also really important to pyramid and our history, because it was founded by an artist, is to maintain my own practice as an artist. So exhibiting, lecturing, doing residencies, so that I'm kind of staying fresh and understanding, the industry. And so I would say, again, in short, it's being an artist currently practicing, and then also for the organization, conceptualizing and coming up with programs and then implementing those programs. And it's really, for lack of a better word and to use a trite word, it's just a fun job. The other day I said to my executive director, I said, what do you think about an exhibition about games? And and she goes, I like it, tell me more. And I was like, well, I'm just thinking about artists who make work in the framework of games, and that could look like, book arts, printmaking, but then, or maybe something like carving a wood block into a ping pong paddle. But then also kind of thinking about the long history of performance art in games. Like, I'm thinking about Matthew Barney's piece of, jumping on a trampoline and making a charcoal drawing on the ceiling. So that physical aspect of using your body, or maybe we have a screen print off where people, it's like dueling pianos, but people are screen printing against each other. And the first one, kind of like Hands on a Hard Body, documentary, the first one who passes out, is the other one's the winner. So to be honest, that's where I thrive. And sometimes it can be totally wackadoodle to Pee Wee's Playhouse kind of, but it's really fun imagining that and having the support to, from the rest of the staff to be like, let's try it. And I know where this is going in my head. I went to another art center not far from us the other day, and they're kind of they're part of, I don't want to give too much away, but they're part of kind of a bigger system of local park and planning. I'll just say that. And
I'm trying to guess what you're talking about. Glen Echo.
no, not Glen Echo, but you're getting closer. But anyway, the point is, I was at a friend's exhibition, and I really wanted to do some social media. Like, finally got to see this artist's exhibition. I'm so excited. And the gallery director was like, well, don't post that because we're not technically open. And I was like, well, wait, I'm here. I'm seeing the exhibition. You allowed me to come in, but you're not open. Anyway, it was so freaking frustrating because they had all these layers of bureaucracy of whether they could be open or they couldn't be open, or were they doing this under the radar, in which case I shouldn't be posting. So the point of it is, I can usually, we have such a small staff at Pyramid Atlantic, I can usually look at my co-conspirator, my executive director, and be like, what do you think about this? Should we be open? Or, and it's so nice that we just kind of look at each other and go, should we do this? Shouldn't we do this? Without all these layers of bureaucracy that many organizations have. So I would say, in this crisis, in this pandemic, it's been really nice to be able to act fast. Another example would be, after George Floyd's murder, we wanted to do something really fast. We didn't want to sit on it. We didn't want to wait. So around that time, we actually had the artist Amos Paul Kennedy, who's really well known for his letterpress printed posters around social justice, and even just some kind of lighthearted, funny and ironic letterpress prints. But what we were getting was, we've got something to say, we need to get it out now. And we plastered the front walls with his permission, the front windows with his letterpress prints. And I hope that kind of accumulation, and that many of those posters really, put it out into the world, or whoever drove by the building, at least, that we support you, or we are against racial injustices, and, Black Lives Matter, to this organization. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, being able to act quickly without a lot of layers and bureaucracy and nuances has been, just really a way that we can thrive and show leadership, I think.
Okay. Well, what I'm started thinking about when you were talking about that is sort of like printmaking. You were mentioned a long time ago now, the use of the antiquated equipment in
Mhm.
this modern era, and so I started thinking about like is the general practice of printmaking, bookmaking, all these kinds of things, is the interest waxing or waning? Because I generally feel like it goes one way or the other. It's very rarely just like plateaued. It's either there's a sudden interest in it, or it's sort of going out of favor, back and forth. So where do you feel like it is right now as far as interests?
I'm trying to answer that question like really honestly from what I've observed, not just to like, oh, it's, so popular and people love it because
Yeah, it is. Well, okay, wait. Okay, you got to understand. I love printmaking. I'm on your side. But the reality of it is it's a very niche thing. It's a very specialized like interest to be not only like a buyer or a collector of it, but also to be a producer of it as well. So like it's always going to be a niche thing, but it sort of ebbs and flows over the years. Like I remember a time when it wasn't very popular at
absolutely.
all to do printmaking, and now and then I do recall a time maybe about 10 years ago when it sort of became, I think it was probably right around like when the Obama poster came out, kind of thing. Like printmaking suddenly had a big influx, and so
Mm,
it goes back and forth. I mean, it's not so, this is no knock on printmaking at all. This is just like, how is it going? Is there a new interest of, let's say, how about this, is majority of your interest in printmaking at this point more older artists by age, older artists coming to printmaking, or younger people coming to printmaking?
mhm. Well, it's interesting you asked that question because here's an observation. So let's take the type shop, for example, letterpress printing. Interestingly, what you'll find is this, and it shouldn't be dichotomous, but just by age, you'll find a big kind of parties of interest. So you find a pretty hardcore party that is a lot about the fine print and about the material, the technique, the light kiss of the paper. And not always, but often what we see is those are older gents, those are older men. And when I say older, maybe anywhere from like 65 to 85, kind of that area of age. And then, interestingly enough, we see a very, very different kind of population that often doesn't know. And I want to put this in a way of like ignorance is bliss, doesn't know those rules and doesn't care, quite honestly. Now, this, of course, these are really big blanket areas because there are certainly a lot of folks in between that. I probably am kind of in between that. And they're making this younger audience is often women, often designers, often kind of DIYers, I would say. And they are creating gig posters, they're creating design ephemera and collateral, and so sometimes you'll even see those two populations sort of printing side by side. We have several presses, and boy howdy, sometimes you want to be careful because there is a big distinction in the aesthetics and the even things like a simple example might be, it still is pretty popular weathered typefaces, and so you'll see kind of this interest in particularly weathered typeface or shitty printing, and when I say shitty, I mean over inked, smashed into the paper, but as a deliberate aesthetic choice. So it's really interesting when you see those kind of groups like run into each other. And quite honestly, I think that's one of the great things about pyramid is you can have that conversation, you can have that those things can coexist.
I was at the University of Iowa, and I
Oh,
remember my professor, who was an older professor, older even when I was there. And I was like, oh, yeah, I want to do this on my lithograph. And he's like, you can't do that. You're going to break the stone. And I was like, let's give it a try. Like, why not? Like in my youth, I loved pushing the boundaries of what was possible and all this kind of stuff. But of course, if I were to go into a printmaking shop now and somebody were to say, "Oh, you can't do that because you might break the stone," I'd go like, "Oh, okay, no, then I won't do that."
Yeah.
Like there is a certain amount of like push and like desire to push the boundaries that youth comes with, that age somewhat sort of makes you a little more timid, or at least a little bit more respectful of.
I like that word, respectful, or yeah. Well, back to your question, or back to your kind of thought. And again, I'm really trying to be honest with myself. And I think this is the honest truth. So, with the 2000s, or I'd say early 2000s to 2012, 13, 14, we saw at Pyramid especially a big shift in digital technologies and methods for production of particularly artist books. And then there became this question of, why even print anything anymore? Why do we need to have that? Is that just kind of doing this visual masturbation of like having this thing, this product? And so I think now what we're experiencing, and I'm really, really happy to see this movement, is this, again, going back to this physical experience, this sensory experience. And you see people putting their nose to prints. You hear people when they walk in say, "Oh, I love that smell. That smell brings me back to my childhood," or that smell brings me back to graduate school. So having that tangible setting each letter, for example, slows you down. And I think, you hear a lot about the slow movement in everything from cooking, but I really do think there's something valuable to the slowing down movement in art too. So to answer your question, I do think people are moving. There's this kind of, the pendulum is swinging back, and I do think people want to have this intentional relationship with their art making and their art that they collect. And of course, that jives really well with our practice at Pyramid Atlantic. Now, again, what you'll see is that I think is really, really nice happening right now is that we're going back into this tradition of prints as protest, as forms of social justice, as something, when you got something to get off your chest, dissemination of ideas, critiques of politicians. And that's really fun to see.
Well, you are in Washington D.C. at a very tumultuous time for sure.
True. I mean, we're poised for that. And I would also argue that we have an amazing collection of wood and lead type, because I think of our location. I feel like DC and Philly are both just that, the long history of printing. So we get calls, not as often as we used to, but we get calls at least once a month, like, "Hey, I'm selling my grandparents' house, and there's like a whole lot of stuff, letters down in the basement, and he used to do this thing," and we're like, "Be right there," you know. So,
Oh yeah, I used to work at the, I think it's called Center for the Book in San
uh-huh.
Francisco, and like one time they said, "Hey, there's this guy selling some old lead type. Would you like to go to his place?" We showed up at this warehouse, and I shit you not, this warehouse was probably 50,000 square feet of nothing but wood and letterpress type, and print images that were all wood type, type high, and all set and ready to go. And he was selling all of it. And we sat there for the whole day for like 8 hours, just rummaging through everything. And we didn't even get through like a tenth of the place. It was amazing. I really hope he didn't throw it all out.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny how things become, they go move in and out of being valuable. And I was thinking about presses, for example. People 20 years ago couldn't pay someone to haul off their presses, and now, sell for $10,000, $12,000.
Yeah, see, I was doing it 20 years ago. So like I was doing it when everything was dirt cheap. Like I
Yeah.
could have bought a press for like I could have bought like a Vandercook was offered to me and they said just pay for the shipping.
Yeah.
Like and they didn't want any money. They said just cover the cost of the shipping
Yeah.
and you can have it. And I was like it was great except I lived on the third floor and that would not have been very good.
Well, wait, so you didn't get it then?
I did not
Yeah.
get it.
Yeah. That would, yeah. No lift, just you lived on the third floor of stairs. Yeah.
A third floor of a wood structured
Oh,
building too. So like I don't think the floors could have
yeah.
supported
That,
it.
yeah. That too. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. So, yeah. I used to run a nonprofit years ago, and it was a photography
Mhm.
darkroom back when darkrooms, like physical wet darkrooms, were a thing. Um, and I went into it thinking like, okay, this photography darkroom, it's going to be all men, and I ended up finding out like 90% of my people were women that were my students and the participants. Like I was shocked because, at the time, photography was more so a male thing than a female thing. So like printmaking, what kind of gender split do you find in printmaking?
Well, it's funny, and actually, no surprise you mentioned that about women, because I find that whether it is our beginning classes to our kind of what we call our master classes, to even using the studios independently, is about, I would say, about 90% women. And I have real no scientific data to back why that up. And I'd want to talk to some other organizations. But here's my personal observation, or my personal hunch. I think oftentimes women are okay with being lifelong learners a little bit more, or maybe okay with being students, or interested in continued learning. And again, this is like super personal and only by hunch, mainly because of what I see in my parents. But I think what you're describing comes as no surprise. So that's how it sort of breaks down. But I would say our instructor base is pretty evenly dispersed, but our student base and our population that regularly uses the studios is heavily, women. I would also go further to say heavily white middle-aged women. And so one of the questions we're always asking ourselves is, how do we change that? How do we recruit? How do we, make that more diverse? So you mentioned earlier in our podcast about printmaking being niche, and I could not agree more. I could not agree more. I mean, I actually wouldn't have gotten into printmaking unless I took it as an undergrad. I think I had to. I can't quite remember, but I was an art education major at the time and had to take a printmaking class and got totally turned out. I was like, this is me. I get it. I appreciate it. The aesthetics, the history, I love it. So yeah, I would say heavily women, heavily white middle-aged women. And so, for us, that's a problem. We do more active recruiting in terms of our interns. We reach out to organizations that work with people of color. We want printmaking to be accessible, inclusive. Yeah. So that's a long answer to your question, but
Well, but DC's, I mean, nothing personal to Washington, D.C., but it's reasonably segregated in many ways. I mean, it's generally not like on racial lines, but on socioeconomic lines. Like there are poor areas and there are wealthy areas. I mean, even in Arlington, where I grew up, there was very distinct lines of sort of the socioeconomic lines. And it's really tough to, because like as a person that wasn't on a higher stratus of the socioeconomic stat line, like it was difficult for the like I was not wealthy, but I was around wealthy people, and they didn't want me in as much. And of course, I was also part of a country club where when I brought like a black friend of mine to the country club, they were like, he can't come here, and I was just like, really? Like seriously, like this was like let's see, late 1980s, and a country club actually turned away a friend of mine because he was black. But anyways, but DC is a bit tough to try and create that because there's a lot of history of sort of a racial divides and things like that in the DC area. And I mean, I would imagine it would be very difficult as a, you all are in the suburbs of Maryland to be able to try and bring in some of those other, just anybody non-white really. So I mean, and part of that too is like, because I'm thinking as a nonprofit, it would benefit you if you can get more diversity in, because then there will be additional grants and other funding outlets that would be accessible to you if you could figure out a way to incorporate them.
Hmm. Well, I will say that we have been in Prince George's County for 5 years. Before that, we were in Montgomery County. And Prince George's County, if you look at the demographics, has much, much, much more diversity. And furthermore, I would say that becomes a little tricky because yay, great, but it becomes tricky when, of course, an organization that has a founder who's white, has, a staff that is primarily white, the last thing you want to be seen as interlopers. So I will say that just by nature of where we are now, our population, our audience is a lot more diverse than it was in Montgomery County. So in a lot of our programs too, take that into consideration. Now, I will say that when we go to printmaking conferences or when people travel down from Philly to visit us, that audience tends to be white and middle class. But I would say in our neighborhood, it's a lot more diverse people who come in, and that's really refreshing. So I'm really glad that we moved, quite honestly, and I'm a Montgomery County resident. So
Indeed. All right. You brought up you talked about collectors. So how is the collector, I don't know, market? Like, I mean, are there a lot of collectors that are collecting printmaking these days, specifically sort of in the DC area? Or even within that, like, too, do you find, because this is one little pet peeve I have about the arts, is a lot of people think that their target market is where they live. So like, you're a DC artist, you think people should be buying your work in DC, but chances are most of the people that buy your work are not in the DC area.
mm-hmm.
So like, are there a lot of people collecting printmaking and books and everything else you all do? And are they all in DC?
Okay. So what we're finding right now, what we're seeing a lot of is folks who have a collector base that, okay, let's make up a illustration. So I'm an
A
artist.
Venn diagram. I love Venn diagrams.
Yeah.
Or an Excel spreadsheet. Could
Yeah.
you do an Excel spreadsheet
I
for me?
I like that. I also love infographics too. Just
Love it.
or org charts. Let's say you're a sculptor and your sculptures start at 25K, something like that. Right now, with our economy, it's such that it is, and the ability maybe to get to a foundry, or I don't know, I'm just kind of making that up. So many artists have figured out or have begun to understand, oh, I can reach an emerging collector audience. And how do they do that? How do they create the same conceptual work, ideas, things that are kind of their signature style, but how do I create it at a different price point to appeal to emerging collectors? And so that's what we see quite a bit of artists who come into Pyramid. They have recognized that the collecting audience is changing. They're changing in what they want to pay. They're changing in what collecting looks like. And so that's what we see quite a few of people coming in these days. We also have a big, I would say, mission or a big kind of idea that collecting should not be for the elite, that collecting and art collecting is for everyone, anybody who wants to collect. Also, this idea of collecting to appreciate, or collecting art that will appreciate, or saying someone is a very important artist, you should collect them. I don't really subscribe to that. I believe that you should collect what is makes you think, what makes you smile, what makes, I mean, I'm saying these things is like all different pockets. What every time you look at it, you see something new and makes you wonder and inspires you. So with that idea, we most of our exhibits, all of our exhibits, 90% of the work has to be for sale. And furthermore, we try to create different price points, less expensive price points, so that work does sell. And I would say, especially in the past 4 to 5 years, Pyramid Atlantic has had a really strong track record of selling work. Just for as an example, in this past exhibition that we had that just closed, for us, selling $9,000 worth of work is pretty dang good for being in a pandemic. And we've had exhibitions in the past year that have sold close to $15,000 of work. And for works that are under $500, and in our last show under $100, I mean, all of the works in our last show were $50. So you can do the math if we sold $9,000 worth of work. We believe also in paying artists for their work. And yes, from time to time, we do have fundraisers and auctions where we are asking artists to donate. But we try to really keep that to a minimum so that we're not, I think artists, this, get hit up all the time, for in lieu of exposure. So
Which is bullshit, but go on.
yes. So we really have a passion for helping people build up their art collection. Now, as I'm kind of answering this question, I'm thinking about where your question about where they based. And I would say that many of our collectors, or many people who buy art in from Pyramid to collect, are actually Prince George's County residents. And we know that because we obviously get that information when we take their payment. But also, even before the pandemic, we try to make it always a habit at our openings to ask, where'd you come from? Or, and so many of them say, oh, I just live right up there, up the street. And we just find that right now, and I think you're seeing this in a lot of different venues, there is a huge push for value-based consumerism. And so supporting the organizations, supporting the artists, supporting things that are valuable to you is where a lot of people are spending their dollars. So we find that Prince George's County, particularly Hyattsville, there's a real focus on supporting hyper local, just, buying local, supporting local. So, to answer your question, I think a lot of our collectors are buyers are from Prince George's County, specifically Hyattsville. Now, that changes a little bit when we move into kind of a different market of price. I find that there's there's a lot of prominent DC based collectors or even national collectors who live outside of the DC area that may be willing to, drop $3,000 or $4,000 for a print by Hung Lu or, Joyce Scott or Renee Stout. So those folks tend to live further out.
Okay, this brings up a topic that I'm actually really fascinated by for my own practice, and I hope other people are too. That when it comes to works on paper, so like I go back to photography, and also I know printmaking is pretty well as well. Certificates of authenticity,
Mm-hmm.
and then sort of how to combine them. Now, I've come up with a system where I create a certificate of authenticity where I handwrite all the details in, and then I have a matching numbered hologram sticker that I put on the certificate and on the back of the work as well, so
Mm-hmm.
that they sort of associate to each other.
Mm.
Is that a common practice, or am I being overly obsessive compulsive?
Hmm. I don't think you can be too obsessive compulsive. I don't, in this practice, think about there's a lot of counterfeit shit going on in the world, but yes, we have for the works that we sell both in our retail space up at the front and our artwork archive, we have certificates of authenticity. Now, the hologram thing, that's pretty fancy. That's pretty cool. You'll have to share with me how you do that offline.
Oh, I'll share it online. There are sticker producing companies. They're all over the United States, all over the world. That you can basically, you just buy matching. They have what are called matching number stickers,
Uh-huh.
and so like basically it's two of like one number 101, and there'll be
Yeah.
two stickers that say 101, and you put one on the back of the work and one on the certificate of authenticity. And basically, if somebody tries to peel up that sticker, it like basically destroys the sticker, so it's basically tamper proof.
Oh,
So it sort of gives a sense of certainty to the buyer that this piece of art
yeah.
goes with this certificate of authenticity.
Matthew, what made you decide to do that? Have you personally experienced some counterfeit or some
No,
facsimile or something?
I picked that up when I was in the United Arab Emirates. I saw some people that had done that, and then I actually had a buyer that specifically asked me for a certificate of authenticity with a hologram sticker on it, and I was just like, "A what?" much like you are. And so I did my own research on it, and he even showed me another piece that he had bought that had it, and I was just like, well, that's amazing, because that creates that like ironclad provenance for that piece for the rest of eternity. Like, so like there will never be a question that those are meant to be together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that definitely has value and of course adds value and gives a certain amount of security to your buyer for sure.
And I've also had the experience where when I take it into a gallery, they're
Mhm.
like, "Oh,
Mhm.
oh, you're very professional." Like it gives that sense, that air
Totally.
of arrogance. Like, ooh.
Well, that's interesting too, right? Because I think there is something about if the artist thinks about these things and shows that certain level of professionalism and respect, I think it can command that from whoever it is, your gallery or your buyer. So I think I'm gonna look into that. Right now we just have certificates of authenticity that the artist signs.
Yeah, Hammermühle actually has a online database that they will create the matching stickers for you, and you
Mhm.
can pay them, and they'll produce a certificate of authenticity with the matching stickers for
Oh
you.
wow.
The system does exist out there,
Mhm.
and paper companies like Hammermühle do create these things for artists.
Interesting. Okay.
All right, one last question. Well, actually, two last questions, but a quick one and then a big one. Quick one is editions. These days, what are you seeing as far as like the size of editions? So, are people doing short run or people doing long run? Like, what's the sort of trend on the size of editions these days?
Well, I think it depends on the project and dissemination and the goals of the project. So, for example, when after George Floyd's murder, and we decided it was really important for Pyramid Atlantic to take a stand, we asked artists to come up with some designs and or if they'd be interested in coming up with some designs, and then after they came up with the designs we would print Pyramid would print them, and again, and then we would give them away for free. Anybody who wanted one of these posters could come and pick one of these up, and the artists were recognized, the printers were recognized. So in that case, the end goal was to get as many out, and we did, I think, 750, something like that, of these. So again, and you can still drive around. This was in when was this? It's during the summer, but you can still drive around and see those prints hanging in people's windows. And so the goal, of course, was to get as many out, get them, into people's hands. So in some cases, though, the artist will, particularly if they're maybe emerging or if this is their first foray into printing, they may choose to do a smaller edition. Sometimes budget plays into it, or sometimes, if we have a grant or some underwriting to produce it, that kind of helps dictate or carry the edition size. But I would say across the board, if it's not for some type of protest, persuasion, social justice issue, where again, the goal is to really get it out there, folks across the board are doing smaller editions and they're doing variable editions. You and I talked a little bit about our background, and after I knew that I really wanted to be a printmaker and change my major from art education to printmaking, and maybe this was maybe some of your experience too, but during our critique, we had to put, I can't remember, 3 or 5 prints up on the critique wall. And part of our grade, not only concept and execution, but was how do these prints look like an edition? How similar do they look? And I'm putting that out there because I think it's a vast departure from a lot of the way we think as printmakers now. I think a lot of the way we think about printmaking is we have a matrix and a substrate, but having that addition of prints is not exactly about making them exactly the same every single one, and having that slight nuance or slight variation, I think. Now, of course, in some cases that you really would want them to be all the same, but I will say smaller editions, variable editions, artist proofs, and experimentation has been of more interest, I'd say, probably in the past 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking as a buyer, like when I go to buy prints, I will always ask to look at numerous prints before I choose which one I want to buy, because I want to see. Because, I mean, no matter how technically perfect you are, there are always little subtle nuances that are
Mhm.
different. And I mean, it could just be the substrate itself, like the paper is slightly different, tone or flecked or deckled or whatever. So, like, I will always want to look at multiple prints before I buy any one, because I want to find just the right combination of, a mistake or an intentional thing, or a combination of the mediums and all the different stuff. Because, and then of course there's the number of the edition as well, because
Mhm.
like I like what do you wait okay when it comes to editions, I generally like low numbers. Like I love buying number one, or even maybe an artist proof,
Mhm.
but I'm not a fan of like number 75 of 75, but I know people that love those. Like, so like, what's your take on that? What do you prefer?
I don't really care, and that's because aside from dry points, most of the matrix are going to hold up through many hundreds of printings. But I am a big advocate. Like if I had a favorite number, I have a friend whose favorite number is 13. And I like that you have a thing. And I kind of wish I had a thing. But right now, because of the resilience and the durability of so many of the matrices that we use now, and I could understand again with dry points and with some etchings, historically, you would want a lower number. You could tell the difference. But now I think unless you have like your thing, and I think that would be really cool to have across the board when you collect, shoot for that. But I'd say it doesn't matter.
What an amazing collection to create. I want to create a collection where every single piece of work in it is number 13 of whatever the edition
Yeah.
is. Like
Yeah.
that's the collection. What's my collection? My collection's number 13.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah. Or even when we do print trades a lot kind of internally, or we invite people to do print trades. When we get them all back, right, and divvy them up, we're making sure that in each portfolio across the board, they're all the same number, so that when you get back your portfolio of 20 prints, your number. And I will say on that kind of favorite thing, some people are like, can I have edition number, 15 out of all of them? So yeah, I'd say the number of the editions does play a role for some people, not for me, but I could see why it would.
Okay, fair enough. All right. Last question. Any advice you can give to anybody out there right now from your experiences, both as a practicing artist, but also as the artistic director of a nonprofit?
I would say if you are out of school, if you are out of your education tribe, I would say, whatever that looks like, find a group. And even if you are an introvert, I'm an introvert personally, finding your people is a really great way to stay connected. And I mean, much like what you're doing, you're connecting with people. So I really believe connection, and that can even look that can be a very indirect way. Like I feel like even if I'm not directly communicating with someone, but I can see them across the shop, pulling these big monoprints, and they're working with Duralar matrices and all sorts of cool stuff. I'm learning, and I'm bringing that in. So I would say find your tribe, make it if you don't have one. I think one of my biggest pet peeves is people saying they're bored, or people saying this town sucks, or whatever it is. It's like, only boring, my mom used to say, only boring people get bored. So find your group that, or create your group. And I can't stress this enough. I mean, you know this. When we get out of school, being in school is the easiest time you're ever going to have as an artist. If you really want it, whatever it looks like for you, gallery representation, teaching, you've got to try. This is an incredibly competitive industry. Most likely it's not going to fall in your lap. So you've really got to create opportunities, try new things, be experimental, put yourself out there. So that's what I'd recommend. That's, it's not going to fall in your lap. So you got to create it. You got to keep on trying if you really want it.
Well, I remember being in DC, and at the time as a student, I thought, "Oh my gosh, I've got to be like the best of the best in DC and all this kind of stuff." But since then, I've now lived, throughout the world in many different places, and like DC is a very small community, arts community in many
Yeah.
ways, and very incestuous. Like the same people exhibit at the same places, and it's all who you know. Like if there's any place that I've experienced that's who you know, that DC was
Mhm.
definitely one of the top ones. And it's a tough market if you're not part of the it crowd to be able to be successful in the DC area.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I would agree with that.
But DC also is has a glut of places like Pyramid Atlantic. There are so many, if you're a potter or a welder or a photographer, there are many nonprofits out there that sort of specialize in whatever you want to specialize. Problem is, of course, like I grew up in Arlington, and so I never went to Pyramid Atlantic because it's in Maryland. Like we don't cross the river. Like you know, much like you Maryland people never come to things in Arlington. We know.
Well, I hear you, and it's so funny because, growing up in Texas where it would take hours to really feel like went somewhere, got into a different state. This area, the DMV area, is so close, but I think there's something psychological. There's also the way money is allocated and broken up. So there becomes like these grant cycles where only DC residents, or only Maryland, or only Northern Virginia, you know, pools of applicants are eligible. So that plays into it. But I think there's just something psychological. I've juried a couple of shows at the Torpedo Factory, and just the thought of like, oh my gosh, I got to go there. Well, and I will also say, this being from this area, traffic is a bear out here. The Beltway is a real, pain in the tail. So that plays into it too. But I think there's something psychological that it just seems so far,
Oh, it does. I mean, but where I grew up, I could literally get to the line of Virginia and Maryland in less than 6 minutes.
mm,
But Maryland felt so far away from me, but it was
right.
only 6 minute drive.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's a very interesting segregate. Like people in DC don't like going to the suburbs. People from the suburbs don't like going into the city, and of course, people from Maryland don't like to go into Virginia, and vice versa. It's a fascinating community because it's in many ways it's very segregated, and part of that is the arts community as well. Because like I found that almost all the artists that I felt like were sort of the it crowd. I mean, keep in mind this is 20 years ago, but like the artists who were in the it crowd were the ones who lived in DC.
Yeah.
Like so that if they lived in DC and they were able to attend all the things easily and able to just drop by and have coffee with people, it always made it much easier for them to sort of be part of the crowd because they were simply, like you were saying, active in the tribe or the community.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, and I also think about people who rely exclusively on public transportation, and in Pyramid's current location and last location, well, no, current location, we are metro accessible-ish. I mean, it's still like probably about a 15-minute walk. But I will say in our old location in Silver Spring, we being right on the red line, yes, it would be a little bit out of the way, but at least it was still very metro accessible. So I think there's something about that too, in terms of proximity. How metro accessible are you?
Certainly. Any last thing you want to bring up that I didn't touch on or that you want to expand on?
Well, maybe this ties into your last question, but I think that especially right now where we're not so immediately connected face to face, being open to problem solving and trying to figure out, okay, what is it that I really need. I think I'm guilty of all the time thinking, if I only had this, and this could be a particular piece of equipment, it could be, I don't know, accessibility or something, if I only had that. And I think what I've really enjoyed seeing right now is, and this happened, I saw it a lot when I was teaching for the University of Maryland last spring when everything shut down and we all had to quickly go online, is how do you look around you, in your kitchen or in your bedroom or wherever it is, and say, okay, I don't have a press. I don't have that particular type of ink or whatever, but what could I use that would still accomplish and fulfill the same challenge or parameters, but I don't have to think, oh, if I only had this. So I guess I talked about this a little bit, but as artists, I think one of your biggest jobs is going to be, how do I problem solve? How do I figure out how to do this with limited resources, limited budget, maybe limited time? And I think if you can thrive there, then it's going to help you figure out some of the things that you just mentioned or we just talked about, like finding your tribe and continuing to make. So yeah, I really like talking about this kind of stuff. So I'm gonna have to listen to the rest of your episodes now too.
There's some ones where we talk about this exact
Oh
kind of
yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, like what you're talking about is basically the idea of limitations,
Hmm.
encouraging creativity.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I find it all the time because, like, throughout my career, I've gone from having amazing resources and amazingly large studios to work in to having no studio and no resources, and then going back to having massive studios and amazing resources and then no studios and no resources throughout my career. So, like, the size, the scale, the intricacy, they all sort of flux depending on, where the world is, how much money I have to spend on something, what resources I have available to me. But one of the things that I think make creative people resilient in this kind of issues is that we, like you say, problem solve. You instead of sitting there going, oh, I can't make art because I don't have those amazing resources, we go, okay, I don't have those amazing resources, what else can I make? And you just keep busy. Like, for me, one of the biggest words that I keep remembering is just tenacity,
Yeah.
is like the most important thing, because if you don't have that, then just go get another career, because you kind of have to have that if you're going to be in the arts.
Exactly, exactly. And I think also another thing that you see more and more people doing is branching out into other areas. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but without that stigma of like, oh, you don't do this, or that is lowbrow, or I think, is it still scratching that itch? Is it still communicating the ideas that you want to communicate? And if the answer is yes to both those things, then I'm really happy to see that those boundaries are opening up. And I used to be really concerned about that, and I still am, to be honest. Like I even when I post anything social media, it's like, how does this play into my brand, or what is this saying, or are people going to think I'm, not a serious artist? And I want to be honest with that. I face that all the time in my deep, insecurities. But I think I'm really happy to see that is becoming more broad and open.
Well, I think more people are just talking about it. Like, I think all artists, as a species, we're all insecure in many ways, in different ways, and our own unique ways. We're insecure, and I think simply more people are talking about that insecurity now than have in the recent past, anyways,
Mm.
because it's just become more common to say, yes, I'm insecure about this. Yes, I'm uncertain about that. I mean, like, it's funny because I just had this conversation with a collector recently, which was that this collector loves, and it's their favorite thing to see, is process videos on Instagram.
Mm,
Like they love seeing the process of creating a piece. Now, me, I'm old school. I'm very traditional. I don't want people to see my process. My process is my thing. I don't want you to see that because I mean, like, I don't know, 40% of whatever I make isn't ever going to see the light of day. So, like, if I show a process video of something and then I end up ruining it, then I'm horribly embarrassed that you saw all those videos because
yeah.
it didn't end up being successful. So, like, I'm very awkward about that. It's very
Mm,
uncomfortable for me to let people see into my process. But that is one of the most popular things these days that people want to feel like they're part of that
yeah.
artistic process.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
I don't like it. I mean, I'll do it, but I don't, it's very awkward for me.
Yeah, it is awkward. It is. But I feel that I can see why collectors, it's like pulling back the curtain, right? And it personalizes.
I don't want the curtain pulled back. I want them to just love my art.
Yeah,
Like they don't need
yeah.
to.
I see both sides of it. I really do.
Don't get me wrong. I love seeing those videos also of other
Yeah.
people, but it's just very awkward for me. Like I, mostly because I think it's because I feel like I fail more than I succeed. And so I don't want people to see my failures. I want them to only see my successes, which of course is, again, that's a generational thing. Like, I mean, I remember my professors and I would see them work at the school on stuff and they would fail at it and they'd be like, that'll never see the light of day. And like, nobody, but the only people that ever saw it were like me because I was standing right next to them. And the only things that made it to the public viewing was just like their absolute best works only. Nothing else ever saw the light of day. But now there's this incredible desire in social media and all these other outlets to see to a certain extent, to see the failures,
Mhm.
to see the mistakes, to see the foibles and things that sort of build up into a success, even if the failures happen.
Yeah.
And I find that very awkward.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, it's awkward if we're the one that it's happening to. But again, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, and I think there's growth in that of people, the viewers, that is seeing that not everything that this person you idolize as an artist is great, and that humanizes them and makes them more like you. And there's also opportunities for growth. I mean, you know this as a professor, there's opportunities for growth because you can see that they what they tried, and at least they're trying, right? At least they're trying something and taking a risk, which I think is also really important as an artist. Yeah, but I understand when it's happening to you, it's not fun.
Yeah, I'm very insecure about a lot of things. But the one thing I'm not insecure about is looking like an idiot on this podcast. I'm perfectly fine with sounding like an idiot. But when it comes to my art, like I want people to highly respect my art and respect the process, respect my concepts. But it's an interesting shift in the dynamic of like people want to see that process more and they want to feel more connected and all this and it's a generational shift. It's something that's changed between when I graduated school and now, and so I gotta keep up with the times, I guess.
Well, you're doing it here, but I do think there's something to that you're okay with not having the answers on this podcast, but insecure about it when in your art. But anyway, that's another side Gretchen Matthew and Gretchen podcast.
Yes, next time.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure. This has really been a great opportunity. Sometimes it's almost like writing an artist statement when you do these things. It's kind of like, well, what is important to me? I've never had to really vocalize it or but when you're forced to do it, when you're forced to talk about it, things become clearer to you. So thank you so much.